This episode of Gators Breakdown is brought to you by MyBookie. MyBookie will match your first deposit by 50% all the way up to $1,000. Head to mybookie.ag and use promo code Gators to activate the offer. Bet, win, get paid at MyBookie. The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And a couple of days after Florida's 24-17 defeat to Georgia, I'm still not happy. And joining me this episode to maybe console me or make me feel a little bit worse, I don't know. We'll see what happens. Is co-host Will Miles here as he joins me every Monday. You can find Will's work at readandreaction.com and him on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. Will, man, I'm still bummed.
Yeah, man, it was actually a rough Monday at work today because everybody knows I'm a fan. None of them really have a vested interest, but they were all watching it because of the teams and the rankings and all that sort of stuff. So it's like, oh, it was a tough weekend for you, that sort of stuff. It's like, yeah, it is, but again, it's you harken back to where we were 2-3 years ago, and it's hard to be too disappointed with a team that is competing with LSU and Georgia and beating everyone else. So, obviously you'd love to win the game, and there aren't any excuses when you're in the SEC, but Florida's building, and hopefully they're going to continue building from this point.
And anybody that was we were talking beforehand, and anybody that was with me Friday night, I won Friday night though. I did win Friday night.
Well, I'm suspecting that Jack Daniels or Jose Cuervo won Friday night there for you, buddy.
It just kept adding up. Some of those. It just kept plenty of beer. Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah, so if you want to hear what Dave really thinks, you need to come to one of his parties because he won't hold back if you catch him late enough in the evening.
Yeah, it was the cocktail party, before the cocktail party. So. Showed up late Saturday, but all in good fun.
Well, that's good, man. I'm glad you had a good time.
Yeah. So, okay. It didn't turn out so good Saturday, but had a good time. Had a good time all weekend anyway. So, thanks to everybody who came and said hello at the tailgate there Saturday as well, and came out Friday night and had some fun. Like only Florida, Georgia can provide. So let's get into. We'll move forward a little bit, but we'll also look back and kind of tie it all together in what these Gators have for the rest of the 2019 season. But before we do, remember, you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. There you'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes. Also catch us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Like so many of you are doing live right now, live on YouTube. So thank you so much for joining us there. When using those services, please share, rate, and review the show. Go leave us a review on those sites, and on social media, follow Gators Breakdown on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. So, Will, man, you really released a really good article and look back at the Georgia game, and kind of how we use that as a map kind of for this episode. It really kind of hits home, really hits hard on the things we kind of need to talk about, need to discuss, and. We released that over at Read and Reaction on late Saturday, Sunday morning. So taking a look back at this close loss to Georgia, you had some interesting and unique takes on the outcome of the game. And in your article titled "What Lessons Can Florida Learn from the Loss to Georgia?" You tackle many aspects to the game and kind of the fallout from all that. But let's take a look forward before we look back for just a second. Of course. Well, I think we'll go back to last year a little bit. This Georgia loss cannot bleed over. I'm deflated, and as deflated as I am as a fan, I hope the team comes out fired up. And I'll admit, I can see where that can be tough because of personally how I feel after that game. But I'm a fan, and their players, they're going to have to put this behind them, go show out versus Vanderbilt, and then extend that to Missouri and Florida State. Florida's going to have to move on. We're only a couple of days removed from the Georgia game, so of course it still stings for the fan base. But days will go by and we'll start to shift to Vanderbilt. So I'd love to see this team finish 10-2. That's a really good season with the season dwindling down. Look, there's only so many chances to see our team play again this season. Only 2 more games in the Swamp this year. One more chance to cheer for our team against a hated rival going through some tough times right now in Tallahassee. I won't predict it, but a very, very outside chance we're cheering for this team in Atlanta in the SEC championship game with some help of Georgia maybe falling on their faces in the next few weeks. But whatever that whether that happens or not, still a high profile bowl game on the docket as long as the team takes care of business. So there's still a lot to look forward to, Will, but that starts with this team taking care of business.
Yeah, this is one of the things that when you looked at the schedule early in the year and tried to predict what might end up happening, I think most of us anticipated that the Georgia game might be a loss, but one of the reasons that I picked picked Florida to go 10-2 among many was that last year after the Georgia game they had Missouri, who was a much more talented team than Vanderbilt, who's coming up on the schedule, and also they had Drew Lock, one of those experienced quarterbacks who seemed to give Grantham some trouble. And this year you go to Vanderbilt, they've had a lot of struggles at the quarterback position. I think really is an opportunity for Florida's defense to get some confidence back. They obviously stopped the run real well the other day, but if they can stop the run against Vanderbilt, that's going to be something where I suspect they're going to have quite a bit of success against the Commodores. And so again, I think it's a good thing. This isn't a cupcake by any means. I mean, Vanderbilt isn't the best team in the SEC by a far stretch, but they're still an SEC team, so they're going to have to come out and play hard. But I don't know that it's necessarily going to have to be their A effort to get the win, particularly at home, especially when you consider that, I think they came out a little bit flat against South Carolina after the LSU game, and they were still able to make to eventually turn the switch and come back in the fourth quarter. But obviously you don't want to leave it up to that in the game against Vanderbilt. And I don't suspect they'll do so. Even if they come out a little bit flat, I think the talent differential is enough that Florida should be able to win that game.
And Florida's probably wearing white helmets this weekend, Will, at home. So you know how that goes.
Well, I mean, they beat Auburn, so I thought they broke that curse there, man. But well, the orange ones haven't worked too well against the big boys of the SEC. So maybe we should stop wearing those.
Yeah, people know how I feel about that ridiculous notion that the color helmet matters in the outcome of a game. So
it's just because you spent $200 on the one behind you there.
I love it. Shut up. But yeah, I mean, of course, you go back to the Vanderbilt game last year. Keyshawn Vaughn gets off to a crazy start, and you're right. Being able to shut down the run last week versus Georgia, maybe goes a long way into kind of defending what Vanderbilt can do as well, and get one of the their best playmaker on offense. That, as you said, that's their way. That's their key to a victory over Florida here. Florida. Dan Mullen did announce today Amari Burney will be out for some time. Jeremiah Moon will be out for some time as well, probably a longer extended time than Burney is. Rumor I heard about Moon was a broken foot, so we'll see where that goes there if that holds any water. But kind of holds up with what Mullen's saying, that he'll be out for an extended period of time there. Maybe Burney only a couple weeks there. So we'll see how that turns out. But Florida will be down some defenders this week. But well, I mean, it is we can't go. Florida can't go back to the way it was last year and how the way they showed up versus Missouri the week after Georgia. And look, we know there's different circumstances here. You'll have Kyle Trask starting instead of Felipe Franks there. You won't necessarily, as you said, necessarily have an experienced quarterback like Drew Lock trying to pick apart a Todd Grantham defense now. And this is a chance to also, I know it's an opponent that you should go beat and beat pretty handily in Vanderbilt. The point spreads, well over 20 points there for the Gators in Vanderbilt. But this is a chance for a defense that has been looked at now 3 games in a row as a pretty weak link on the team, maybe, or at least a weaker link on the team. I don't care who you're playing. You need to go out there. You need to go out there and show something.
Yeah, I mean, Neal for Vanderbilt hasn't been that great. Vanderbilt, I think, is a 26-point underdog in this game. So, even if Florida wins by a touchdown or two, I think that's still a win. I don't necessarily expect them, like I said, I don't expect them to come out and just absolutely dominate. I think we saw that a couple of weeks ago with Georgia coming out against Kentucky. I think we all sort of expected them to come out angry, and I think they came out a little bit shell-shocked to start that first half. Wouldn't surprise me if Florida got off to a slow start against Vanderbilt in the first half, but at the end of the day, the talent differential is so substantial. Florida just has better players, even with the injuries. I suspect that they'll eventually be able to take control.
All right, Will. So yeah, we'll take a look at your article, man, and kind of let it map this this episode and the way we'll go. And I think The one part that I found the most polarizing was the point that the Gators missed Felipe Franks, and now you did. Look, I don't think you meant it this way, and I don't mean it this way. It's not a Kyle Trask versus Felipe Franks debate. That's not what we're looking at here. It's not to, prop up one while downing the other. That's not the purpose, not the hit here. But you're right there in certain aspects, of this Dan Mullen offense that Felipe Franks excelled in use like their. And there's certain aspects Kyle Trask excels in. So there's both quarterbacks do different things in this Dan Mullen offense and doing pretty well. There are games where Florida would have missed Kyle Trask, just like they've missed Felipe Franks in certain aspects of this loss to Georgia. So credit Dan Mullen to where we can give credit to two quarterbacks here. So where I can agree with you there is, is apply it to where Dan Mullen and this offense versus Georgia is the opening drive. You pointed to it in your article many times. It's the 4th and inches. Florida goes empty set, then throws an incomplete pass to Kyle Pitts. Momentum is stopped, and Georgia takes over. No doubt in my mind that even with this offensive line, everything being the same, if Felipe Franks is quarterback, that's a quarterback sneak. That's a quarterback power. It's a quarterback run of some sorts there to get that first down. To me, it should have been called with Kyle Trask, but it wasn't. So, look, we knew there would be certain aspects of this offense that changed when Kyle Trask took over, but in certain short yardage situations, I'm not so sure it has to change all that much. We've seen Trask convert some of those this season, but wasn't really given a chance versus Georgia to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean it as when I wrote it, I didn't mean it as a denigration of Trask, really. And in fact, I said that he's better at reading defenses than Franks, perhaps even a better pure passer. But at least in Mullen's offense, I don't know that means he's a better quarterback. And that's one of the reasons, I talk about yards above replacement, a statistic that I've developed really in response to Mullen being hired at Florida, because it was hard to understand how good his offenses were, considering that he had some pretty substandard passers there other than Dak Prescott. And, what you see is that, so what that really does is it puts an emphasis on yards per attempt, both through the air and on the ground. And Trask has taken a lot more sacks than Franks took. Franks got out of the pocket awfully early, and I think Trask sits in the pocket more often than Franks, so is able to make plays from the pocket. But Franks rarely took like the 20-yard sack. I think there was a 19-yard sack and a 10-yard sack that just completely killed Florida's drives. And that matters, right? And then the other thing is that he completed, I think, 77% of his throws in the first 4 games, including UT Martin as one of those 4 games, and came out and just played really, really well against Kentucky. I don't think Florida wins that game without Trask at quarterback. Tennessee, he comes out and just lights it up. But his completion percentage has dropped now to about 62% over the last 4 games. And again, 62% is still pretty good, but his yards per completion have been relatively steady. So his yards per attempt have gone down considerably. And that's something that, last year towards the end of the year, Franks was completing passes about a 9 yards per attempt clip. And that's kind of where he started out this year. So, you look at where Franks was. I mean, I think if you believe Dan Mullen's a good coach and you believe he knows what he's doing, then there was a reason that Franks was starting over Trask. I think some people had some PTSD maybe from 2017, and so didn't necessarily think that wanted to see what Trask could do or wanted to see what Emory Jones could do. But the other thing is that Franks was injured running the ball on one of those quarterback runs, and so that's the risk in Mullen's offense. So again, it wasn't meant to be necessarily a shot at anybody. I actually think Trask has played very, very well in relief of Franks, but I think people underrate Franks and some of the things that he did that didn't necessarily look pretty. Some of the things Trask does look pretty, but Franks didn't do a whole lot that looked pretty, but he got the first down or he got the touchdown when you were, 3rd and 2. Against South Carolina last year, all those quarterback powers that got the ball in to win that game, so he's a good player. I think people tend to undervalue some of the things that he does, but at least in the way I metric quarterbacks, I think he does some things very, very well that add to his value.
All right, well, so I had a tweet sent to us from at CT Gator Fan 81, and of course, we only have so much time here per episode, so he was hoping, I guess Will Salmon and I yesterday He said, hoping you guys would have dipped into the running game a little more because I was interested in why Mullen wouldn't use Emory to create more second level space and use him as a quote willing runner when we needed it the most. So, of course, Emory Jones, a hot topic as well out there in the Twitter world, and kind of comparing what he could bring to the table, and kind of what we were just kind of discussing with Kyle Trask and Felipe Frank, certain things that he could bring to the table. Maybe the ceiling's a little bit higher because he is a true dual threat quarterback here in Dan Mullen's offense. To me, Kyle Trask right now is the best option moving forward for this season. I am perplexed at the use of Emory Jones right now. You go back to a couple games ago in LSU, it seems like they had that figured out in ways they wanted to bring him in, certain situations they wanted to bring him in. Then one play versus South Carolina and one play versus Georgia. And those one plays that he came in were very questionable, especially this Georgia game. Kyle Trask could just completed 2 downfield passes and pull him out, kind of stop some momentum to bring Emory Jones in, and a run that really doesn't do much there. So, Will, when we started thinking when Kyle Trask was going to be quarterback, we thought we'd see Emory Jones a little more just because of trouble in the run game, and maybe he can help spark the run game a bit. And we always go back to the Chris Leak, Tim Tebow combination in 2006. And if you go back to that, it looked like Dan Mullen knew exactly when to insert Tebow, or even you as a fan base could sit in there in the stands or could sit there and watch TV and know, hey, it's 3rd and 2, hey, it's 3rd and 1. Tim Tebow's coming in, he's coming in to get the first down. There's not a lot of predictability of when Emory Jones is going to come in. I don't know if that's planned or not. But there does seem, for Tebow in 2006, there was a defined role. It seems right now there's not much of a defined role for Emory Jones in what we've seen the past 3 games, and it's weird. It just seems really weird and odd at times when Dan Mullen wants to bring him in. And Mullen said today in his press conference, he was asked about it, and he said, look, the plan was to get Emory Jones more. It was in the game plan, but they didn't run a whole lot of offensive plays. It was really taken out of their game plan because the way Georgia was controlling the ball and converting 3rd down after 3rd down. Will, it's just it is a puzzling piece to this offense right now.
Yeah, I mean, I hear where Mullen's coming from there. I mean, Florida only really had 7 offensive possessions, right? Couldn't get Georgia's defense off the field, or couldn't get Georgia's offense off the field, and then you're down almost immediately, and so they turn the ball over on downs on the first drive. That's maybe a place where you might have gotten Emory Jones in, and then the second drive you punt, and by then you're down 10-0, and you got to really start thinking about, well, what does, how do I score, and how do I score quickly? Because I can't necessarily, I think maybe they weren't quite patient enough in the second quarter. They went right down the field for that field goal after the touchdown on the bad call by Cager. They went right down the field for a field goal, scored so quickly that Georgia could sort of turn it around and come back for another field goal. And then, Georgia comes down and scores coming out of the half, and you're down by a considerable amount, and now you got to start throwing the ball. And the way the defense was playing, they only had 3 possessions in the second half. So I don't necessarily know when you're going to put Emory Jones in there. They really were too far behind. By the time they got down 13-3, they were really too far behind, I think, to probably think about bringing him in. I think they had a plan for him against LSU. That was pretty clear. Here they got sort of knocked out of their plan because I think they expected to perform better on the defensive side of the ball, certainly at least to stop 50% of the 3rd down conversions. And because they weren't able to get off the field, because Georgia dominated time of possession, it was one of those things where I suspect that they just didn't get him in the game because the only way they could move the ball was throwing it. And really they had a game plan that was tied around throwing it. And if you're going to throw and that's your game plan, then Trask is the guy you'd want to be running it.
Yeah, Mullen said coming into this game they did not feel good about being able to run the ball on Georgia, and that's where we'll go next. A one-dimensional offense. Hey, look, it can work versus most teams on Florida's schedule. Florida faces because of talent. Florida's still more talented than most of the teams on the schedule right now. That's not going to work versus Georgia. here in their talented defense. Will, you stressed last week how important it is for the Gators to be balanced, and we know how important running the ball is for Dan Mullen's offense, and whether that comes from the quarterback and or the running backs, it needs to be there versus better teams on the schedule. And that was the most glaring disparity in where recruiting come into play here versus Georgia. It was a mismatch in the trenches. Now, Georgia wasn't able to get the run game going like they thought either, but it was good enough and got better as the game went on. But Florida's offensive line was nowhere near up to the task of getting the job done and opening holes for these running backs. I do subscribe to the thought that Florida maybe should have tried to run the ball a bit more, but they were getting killed on first down in running situations. As I said yesterday's podcast, only 2.5 yard rush average on first down when Florida tried to run on first down. So, with that, Mullen, didn't trust to get the necessary production out of that group, and it really affected his play calling. And Kirby Smart was talking about his own team after the game, but also I think he could have been discussing Florida at the same time. And a quote from Kirby Smart is, after the game was, "If you don't run the ball in this league, pass rushers will chew you up. When they see pass every play, they'll feast. It's like sharks in the water. They'll attack you. You've got to keep them honest. You got to wear them down. I know y'all don't believe in it, and y'all think it's boring, and y'all hate it, and it's not explosive. I get it. Okay. But in this league, you've got to have the threat of that in order to sustain." So, he was asked in discussing of his own run game, but I'm telling you, at the same time, that quote really pertains to Florida at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the deal. Through three quarters, Florida had 12 rush attempts for -8 yards.
Yeah.
And certainly that does reflect a couple of sacks, but there was only one tackle behind the line of scrimmage on the third down that Pierce got stuffed on. And other than that, they were at least getting 2, 3, 4 yards. And at some point, you got to help out your quarterback and give him a 2nd and 6 every once in a while. Now, if the offensive line can't give him a 2nd and 6, then that's a problem. I mean, that's the reality is that's a problem. And that's something that I think you need to scheme around. And that's maybe the thing that was the most disappointing out of everything is, on the 4th and 1, I kind of expected them to run a reverse to Tony, like they ran against Michigan last year, or at least to fake it. I think they actually, it looked like they were going to fake it on the 3rd and 1 before they got called for the false start.
Yeah.
But, in some capacity, 4th and inches, I know, like, I understand why he threw the ball there, but going empty set and basically announcing to Georgia that you're not going to run, I'm not sure, unless you're actually going to run Trask that game.
Right.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So not a whole lot of misdirection, not a whole lot of creativity in the run game. It's basically read option and a quarterback who's not necessarily keeping it when the defensive end crashes as much as he should. And so the running game's struggling. And, I get why he's passing the ball. I mean, they averaged 9.2 yards per throw through the first 3 quarters, dropped down to 7.8 when you added in the 4th quarter. That's because they sort of dinked and dunked their way down the field on the last drive. So, I mean, I get why they're throwing the ball, but at the same time, I mean, that's the South Carolina and LSU games were perfect examples. In the scoring drives in those 2 games, 40 run plays, 35 pass plays. In the non-scoring drives, 25 run plays, 47 pass plays. It was a little bit more. I mean, it was just so pass happy that even on the scoring drives, Florida was able to score. So they had 22 pass plays and 9 run plays. But again, one of those is that 11, the 17 play drive to end the game that had 11 pass plays in it. So, you're going to have to run the ball in this league to be successful long term. Mullen knows it too. It's not just Smart who knows it. And I know people complain about Smart running the ball, and in some capacity, the fact that they're not explosive is an issue, but they still threw the ball 30 times in this game. Yeah. So it's not as if they were incredibly one-sided. I mean, the reason they won the game is that Fromm completed damn near every third down pass he threw. And, yes, they ran the ball, but not real effectively. I mean, 37.
Like I said, it got better as the game went on. They started going outside a little bit more, but they stuck with it and got some important third down conversions out of it too.
Yeah, but again, if you look at it, Florida had 12 rush attempts and 20 pass attempts through 3 quarters when the game was really in doubt. Georgia, 27 and 27.
Mm-hmm.
So not only was it 54 plays to 32 plays, but Georgia was in balance, and that makes a difference. And in fact, you see it when you start looking at the yards per play averages per quarter. So Florida started out 4.9, then 7.6, then 4.6, 5.2 in the third and the fourth quarter, whereas Georgia went 3.3, 5.6, 7.7, and 8.2. So, as they wore down the Florida defense, kept them on the field, kept converting those third downs that were sort of dinks and dunks, and, a 16-play drive to lead for a field goal. Then they have an 8-play drive with a punt, then a 10-play drive for a touchdown. By the time those first 3 drives were over, Florida's defense was sort of sucking wind, and the offense didn't do a good enough job of giving them a blow to be able to sort of stem the tide.
Yeah, and Georgia's offense is built off play action a lot as well. So they kind of have to stick to the run game for that complete offense to work. And of course, the big touchdown at the end of the game, or to cager the 50-yard, 52-yard touchdown, whatever it was around there, it's off of a play action there.
Yeah, well, and even if you're not running the ball effectively, if you're just running it, the play action becomes effective. And that's one of the things is the linebackers, clearly there was an RPO that trashed through that almost got tipped by a linebacker. And Danielson, when he was commentating, was talking about how they're teaching linebackers not to crash to the line of scrimmage as sort of a defense against RPOs. But the reality is, why would you crash to the line of scrimmage? You're getting all attack. You're stopping the run game with your front four. And even if you're not, Florida isn't running the ball anyway. Like, there's no risk. Like, there's no reason for that linebacker to come up. It means the windows get tighter. You start making mistakes. The ball gets tipped, those sorts of things. Again, I think Florida was sort of on the cusp of putting together a couple of really good drives, especially in the first one. I mean, if they could have converted that first one, but, at the end of the day, getting to the 40-yard line doesn't get you much of anything. They did that 3 or 4 times and came away with nothing. And, when that happens, you're going to struggle to score points.
Yep. So another part of your article, Will, here over at readandreaction.com. The wrong coach is getting blamed in response to a lot of, remarks thrown towards defensive coordinator Todd Grantham. Look, this was certainly a complete staff loss here. This game, and just kind of a list here. We just talked about it. The 4th and 1 call, abandoning the run, having to burn timeouts because players can't get lined up. A long touchdown drive that really needed to be a whole lot quicker on the clock here. Chris Blight starting instead of Richard Garage. 3rd down conversion, secondary miscommunication, soft zone coverage, trading taking advantage of at star, not enough blitzes. So now, don't get me wrong. There's enough blame to go around as far as execution as well. I just mentioned Trey Dean. The staff keeps throwing him out there. He needs to perform. These corners, especially Marco Wilson, can cover better, tackle better. Blame deserves to go all around. And I think the most frustrating part, as many as these were year-long issues, and at least from a staff perspective, items we hope that would be corrected or be improved upon during the bye week.
Yeah, I mean, I get the frustration. I think most of the ire that I heard was aimed towards Grantham, and hey, his defense couldn't get off the field and couldn't stop 3rd down conversions. But at the same time, like, that kind of is who he is. I mean, I remember saying when he was hired that I was sort of like, he's a good defensive coordinator. He's not a difference maker. And I think that's what we're seeing this year, is that he's a good defensive coordinator. He's not a difference maker. And his scheme, particularly against quarterbacks who have experience and are above average, is something that that can be exploited, because there are things about it that if you've got the experience to be able to pick it apart, you can do that. Now, against young quarterbacks, Florida has excelled, and I think that happened last year as well. And the good news is that most of the time you're playing young quarterbacks who are inexperienced, and so against a guy like Bo Nix, that's the kind of guy who perfectly plays into what Grantham's trying to do, because he's bringing pressure from all over the place, and it's hard for that guy to pinpoint the matchups. But if you can pinpoint the matchups pre-snap, then you can do a lot. Drew Lock did it last year. It was one of those things where Florida just couldn't get to him and put pressure on him, and they sort of did the same thing this year. And one of the things I've been thinking about, starting after the LSU game, but really I think it was cemented after the Georgia game, is we've talked a lot about the idea of flexibility that Grantham and Mullen have talked a lot about flexibility with the guys on defense. And, the idea that you can take Amari Burney and you can play him at safety or linebacker, and you can take Dean and you can play him at safety or star or corner. But that's also kind of saying that your team as a whole is not talented enough to stack up to have a guy who's just a stud linebacker, to have a guy who's a stud safety, to have a guy who's a stud in that star role. And, that versatility is great against a lot of teams. But I think when you come up against teams that are really, really high level, the problem is that all of a sudden they've got guys who are studs at both places. And they can, at tight end and at wide receiver, and they can start to take advantage of those guys who are sort of hybrid. And I wonder whether maybe that's kind of what's happening here is you got a guy who's a little bit uncomfortable in coverage, a little bit uncomfortable against the run, and all of a sudden the team with more talent is able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, now the next one, in going through your article, and the one that draws a lot of headlines, especially for what we've done here on Gators Breakdown since we've kind of been in inception, is recruiting matters. So it's always a hot topic, and look, I hate talking recruiting a whole lot during the season. I try and enjoy these 12 games a year as much as I can. As a rule for myself, I just don't do it much during the season, but it is applicable when discussing this game, and many in Gator Nation subscribe to the thought that Dan Mullen is a better head coach than Kirby Smart. Well, if you believe that, then the difference in their head-to-head matchups is talent, and that's what it boils down to. If that's what you believe, that's where the difference is. I've always said this. I tend to believe Kirby's a pretty good coach. He has a lot of talent to work with. Made some boneheaded mistakes that get magnified because of when most of those have happened in big games. He's in those big games because he's a pretty good head coach and has a lot of talent. So if you really subscribe to the thought that Mullen is a great head coach, he is. I do believe that, but he's still failing in these types of games when the final step is just bringing in better players. It doesn't mean he'll never beat Georgia if he doesn't bring in top 3 classes, but I just know the man can coach, and I know Dan Mullen can develop. Give him some 4- and 5-star players to do it with, and Mullen's going to win some big games. He's going to win some championships. But until wins versus Georgia, LSU, Alabama, those types of teams, until he brings in that type of talent, those types of wins against these teams consistently are going to be really hard to come by.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When we discuss recruiting and claim and say that it's important, the refrain is usually, well, once he shows it on the field, he'll be able to bring in the high level recruits. And beating Georgia is part of showing it on the field. So if you're not going to have those top 5 classes to start with, then you got to start beating those top 5 programs in order to get into that space. And that I think is maybe the concern with this game, is that, a win against Georgia says something about your program and says something about the momentum and says something to the people that you're recruiting. But, I think recruiting for the most part is about relationships. And so the question is, what kind of relationships are you building? And, here's the reality. Georgia's roster has 14 5-stars right now, 45 4-stars, and 25 3-stars. Florida has 1 5-star who's not eligible to play right now, 38 4-stars, and 35 3-stars. It is a significant difference. This is not like the difference between Florida and Tennessee, where Tennessee is slightly less talented. This is a significant difference. And if you're upset about the way the defense played on Saturday, well, all 4 defensive linemen were 3-star recruits. David Reese and Ventrell Miller were 3-star recruits. Trey Dean, Marco Wilson, and C.J. Henderson were 4-star recruits. But then Juwan Taylor, Donovan Steiner, and then Sean Davis were 3-stars with Brad Stewart as a 4-star back there. So, the average of those guys, if you take the safety rotation into account, the average star ranking of those guys is 3.3. So is a team that gives up 24 points to Georgia and struggles to get off the field, maybe that's what we should have expected. I mean, I think a lot of those guys have overachieved. I think a lot of them have proven to be high-level SEC players. but those are the guys who are winning the job. And so the two deep then is guys who are going to struggle as well. There just hasn't been anybody to plug them in. You mentioned earlier Jeremiah Moon being hurt, Amari Burney being hurt. Who are the guys who are going to step into that role now? I mean, I know there are a lot of people who are upset about Trey Dean, but I think the interesting thing is I remember 3 years ago when everyone was upset about Chauncey Gardner-Johnson in that star position, sort of looking a little bit out of sorts, really with tackling more than he was with tackling more than he was with coverage. But again, it takes time to develop into that slot corner position. And I think, the only way you're going to get better is by being out there playing. So yeah, I mean, I think recruiting is a big deal, obviously. The issue is that Florida's basically where they were. They're exactly where they are this year is where they were last year and where they were the year before. So that's the level of talent. I think Mullen's bringing in more talent than McElwain did before him. I think Mullen's better at developing that talent. But really what we're looking at, and I think this has been the refrain of people who really look at recruiting and harp on it, is being the Auburn of the East, right? That you look at Malzahn, you look at the way that he recruits. It's not as good as Alabama. Every once in a while, he's able to get a team that can go and beat Alabama. But consistently, Alabama is the team that leads the West. And the way the recruiting rankings have gone thus far, that's what it looks like in the East. And that's why this loss is deflating, because you sort of say, some of the mistakes that were made out there point to the coach on the Florida side, and that's a little bit bothersome.
Yep. So, I mentioned it to you before we came on here. Inside the Gators did a really good article on the mark by Mark Wheeler and some calculations in looking at next year. And it doesn't get much better. So he does say here, a quote from the Inside the Gators article here: "To be clear, in the calculation for next year, we are assuming every player other than the seniors will return, while also factoring in those prospects who are already committed to each school. For Florida, that means the total takes off for this are Tyree Cleveland and Van Jefferson, but includes Trevon Grimes, Felipe Franks, Gervin Dexter, and Derek Wingo. And if you include Cox, who was signed by Georgia out of high school, but take off Demetrius Robertson for Georgia, transferred in there for next season. So as it stands today, the 23 highest rated players in the game will have been signed by the Bulldogs staff. So, but Cox will be on Florida's roster. So, but still, Georgia signed him. So the 23 highest rated players will have been signed by Georgia. And he says, think about this for a second or longer. As of today, of the top 30 rated prospects in next year's game, the top 15 in a row and an incredible 28 overall will be on the Georgia sideline."
Well, that sounds like fun. I mean, it goes a little bit deeper than that too, because if you look at the starters for Florida, 5 of them were from the 2000, at least coming into the year. 5 of them were from the 2015 class, 8 from the 2016 class, and 6 from the 2017 class. Only 3 of those guys were from 18 or 19, which are Mullen's first 2 recruiting classes. If you compare that to Georgia, they had 7 from 2016, 7 from 2017, 3 from 2018, 2 from 2019. So they got guys out there starting right away. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is that they're more front loaded. So yeah, there are going to be guys who leave who are juniors, but they've got guys who are getting experience. I mean, who are the guys on the Florida team from the 19 class who are really getting a ton of experience? I mean, you've obviously got Kyrie Elam out there. A couple of the corners are getting more than a cup of coffee.
Diabate.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. So you got a couple of guys who are getting out there getting experience, but not a whole lot of them. No, yeah. So we haven't seen a real difference maker from that 2019 class. And that's what everybody sort of was hoping Chris Steele would be there on the outside, though obviously transferred back to USC. I think that's actually maybe – so the recruiting is sort of twofold, right? I mean, the first part is who are the guys you bring in, but the other is, you need numbers because not every guy hits. And so, the loss of Chris Steele, the loss of DeJuan Black, Davey Hammond, Jalen Jones and Wardrick Wilson. I mean, some of these guys needed to go, right? But
and Huggins too, if you want to go back to him for another class.
Well, and I mean, Justin Watkins, Randy Russell, Malik Langham, who transferred out. So, I mean, it would have been really nice to have Malik Langham out there playing on the defensive line. And so, the reality is there's been an awful lot of attrition from classes that are borderline top 10. And if you're going to be borderline top 10, you can't have a whole lot of attrition. And I haven't gone back and looked at it, but I suspect that Clemson's classes, which everybody sort of points to when they talk about top 10 classes developing into elite teams, I suspect there wasn't a whole lot of attrition from those classes. But that'd actually be an interesting thing to look at. But I'm going to guess that they hit on a higher percentage than most people do, and that they didn't have guys leave the program for different reasons. So again, I don't want to harp on this too long. At the end of the day, it is what it is, right? I think you look at strengths and weaknesses, and when we look at Kirby Smart, we say, hey, there are some weaknesses in terms of his on-field coaching, his decision-making, but obviously he's really good at recruiting. And I think you look at Mullen and you say he's really good on field. He does a great job developing his players. There are some weaknesses in recruiting. Are there places where he can make that stronger? Probably. I think there are probably some things he'd change if he were coaching that game against Georgia over again. But end of the day, it is what it is. He's not going anywhere. And the question is going to be, can he take those classes and turn them into elite units? I think he can. I just think it's going to take a little bit more time. It's going to be one of those things where he's going to have to develop the players. And one of the things with the attrition is that, you were talking about next year. Part of that is just because of all the guys who can leave.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of seniors who are leaving next year. And that's, depending upon who all, so is Felipe Franks going to come back? P. Ryan's gone. Cleveland's gone. Jefferson's gone. Hammond's gone. Forsyth and Heggie are juniors, but they're probably going to stay. Buchanan is a senior. You've got Grimes and Swain. You've got Malik Davis. Is he going to transfer with the other running backs they brought in? You've got Kadarius Toney. I don't know what's going to happen with him. You got Jabari Zuniga, Schuler, Grenard, Reese, all those guys on the defensive side of the ball.
Wilson, Henderson.
Yeah, so I mean, this team could look completely different next year, and you're going to need reinforcements to come in, and we'll see whether. Again, I think nobody's crying for you. You're going to have to make do with the guys you brought in, and they brought. And again, to be clear, I think they brought in some very, very good players. But
I got laughed at, Will, by rival fan bases when we come into the season. And when I brought this up before, when we were going through all the preseason magazines, and Florida had a lot of first teamers, second teamers, third teamers guys because of those guys were experienced. It wasn't because they were highly rated recruits and they were just getting based off of talent, but you had players like Jabari Zuniga who were getting first team all SEC selections. He was a 3-star, kind of developed, who's been experienced. He was a senior. He was able to build his way to become that type of player there. And of course, now he's not playing much this year because of an injury. But you had the deep receiver core. You had LaMichael P. Ryan getting a whole lot of credit. You had Felipe Franks getting a whole lot of credit. Wilson, Henderson. It wasn't far fetched to say. I came into the season saying, "Hey, look, this might be the year to get Georgia because of all that talent returning, all that experience, that talent returning." So that went to, hey, you have guys that you've brought in that got developed. Some of them weren't your guys; they were McElwain's guys. Some you brought in as transfers, like Grimes and Jefferson. It was kind of a perfect storm of players that Dan Mullen had assembled and brought together and developed that gave Florida a chance this year.
Yeah, the other thing is that obviously coming off the Georgia game, we're disappointed and we wanted to win the game and things like that. But the team's 7-2.
Yep.
And they've lost to two teams that may end up playing each other in the SEC championship game. So, if you're the third or fourth best team in the conference, is that a reasonable expectation for where they've recruited? Yeah, I think so. Is that a reasonable expectation for year 2 under Mullen? Is that progress? Yeah, I think so. So, and again, 2 years ago under McElwain, we would have been killing for just progress, right? I mean, that was like your word of the 2017
It was.
season.
Yep.
And by the time we got past Texas A&M that year, progress was a 4-letter word on the Gators Breakdown podcast because it never happened. So
progress was McElwain getting fired.
So, again, I go back and I look at it, and there's plenty of time to talk about recruiting, I'm sure, this offseason.
Yeah.
I think it does rear its head, especially when you start talking about injuries. It's not something that you can ignore when you're watching a game where clearly Georgia had a much better offensive line than Florida did, and it protected Fromm and gave him freedom. And you wonder what would happen if you put Trask behind an offensive line that could give him that kind of time and that kind of, and what could happen with these wide receivers if they had that kind of time. But that's sort of the nature of going through constant coaching changes and then not necessarily having elite recruiting classes, is that you end up with one unit that's strong and another unit that's not, or one unit that's able to carry you for a while, but then you have some injuries and they end up being a unit that's not quite as good by the end of the year. And I think that's really what's happened, is injuries have taken a toll, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And you don't have the same defense on the field that they did against Auburn. You just don't. And you're starting to see that. So that's one of the reasons why UCF can't play in the SEC, or why people in the SEC at least took umbrage to their claimed national championship, is that there's a big difference between playing Akron and playing Georgia and LSU, and Florida's starting to feel that now. And it's not these kids are playing hard. It has nothing to do with how hard they're playing. I think the reality is that sometimes you come up against teams that are better than you. That's okay. You tip your hat to them and you say, hey, let's go finish out the season strong.
All right. Well, before we go here on this episode, the school out west, they're looking for a new head coach. Willie Taggart gets fired here in the second season. Didn't make it quite through his second season, but in the second season, through 9 games there. So FSU will be looking for a new head coach. Bob Stoops is the hot name out there right now. Mark Stoops as well. From Kentucky, getting some getting some love. PJ Fleck, Mike Norvell, other names that people are bringing up. So we'll see where FSU ends up going there. But Will, man, just don't think anybody could have ever predicted that Willie Taggart wouldn't make it through the end of the second season in Tallahassee.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. I think it's a little bit sad too. I mean, you look at him. I've obviously enjoyed seeing Taggart struggle because I enjoy seeing FSU struggle. But at the same time, he hasn't been as bad as some of the other coaches out there who still have jobs. One of whom almost became the Gators head coach and is now driving UCLA directly into the ocean. Mm-hmm. So you look at it and you say, I think he's made some missteps in terms of public relations. I think that's been a big problem. I think there are some components here that make me a little bit uneasy about an African-American head coach who gets fired after 21 games versus some of the other guys who get opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. But at the same time, I mean, it's one of those things where if the money stops coming from boosters and the boosters start demanding things, then we saw it with McElwain as well. I mean, that was obviously the death threats are a little bit different situation, but still at the same time, like once he lost the fan base, they had to do something, and I think that's kind of what they felt at Florida State. So, I would have liked to have seen Taggart be good but not great, just because I think a strong Florida State is a good thing for Florida if they can consistently beat them. I am curious, though, after giving a guy 21 games, I mean, what kind of guarantees do you have to give to the next guy coming in? Like, they better make sure they get it right, because if they don't, they're going to be on the hook for like a $70 million buyout. I mean, if I'm Mark Stoops, I'm comfortable at Kentucky. They'll have me there forever, right? So it's going to take like a Jimbo Fisher contract to get me to come to Florida State. And at that point, they probably should have just given the money to Jimbo Fisher.
True. That's really that's all it came down to. He wanted more. There was look, I don't know, FSU probably wouldn't have been able to keep matching what Texas A&M probably would have kept. they would have upped the ante even more to get him there. But you're right. I mean, we do know the money was there now. They could come up with money to make what they wanted to happen. But it is. It's kind of weird. We'll see where FSU ends up and who they end up hiring. But look, all you have to do was look at it was FSU Miami. Look, I know both programs are nowhere near what they were, what they can be. But man, I mean, empty, for a rivalry game, empty seats, plenty of empty seats in Tallahassee for that game. And look, even for as downtrodden as Florida has been in recent years, when it was a rivalry game in the Swamp, the Swamp was still full. The Swamp was still full. If Florida was playing FSU and Florida was looking at a 4-win season, the Swamp was full. So, it was those rivalry games still meant something. And so you could just tell, the city of Tallahassee, the stadium, the university probably losing out on a whole lot of money of attendance in Tallahassee was not going strong.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's usually why these sorts of changes are made. I mean, there'd be a lot more patience for head coaches if the money didn't stop, even though they were losing games. The reason there's no patience for them anymore, one is because you're paying them so much money, but two, just because, especially in the Twitter world now, you opinions can go around, and the narrative becomes that he's not going to be able to turn it around. That starts getting to recruits. So, and that I think is the thing that sort of really seals Taggart's fate, is that he had it basically one of the top 5 talented rosters in the country over the last couple of years. And you can argue that, hey, there were holes on the offensive line, that he had some issues at quarterback. Okay, that's fine. But that doesn't mean you should be losing to Wake Forest and Boston College and things like that. So the fact that he was losing with those types of classes, but then he is not able to sell the hope side of it. I mean, when you look at Florida right now, like Mullen may not be recruiting at Kirby Smart or Nick Saban's level, but he can sell the hope that, hey, we're getting better, we're seeing progress, the team is going 10-2, 11-2, whatever they'll end up this year, and there's no hope to sell from a record perspective, and the talent level in Tallahassee is going down because his recruiting was basically equivalent to Mullins the first couple of years, but there have been no results on the field. And so, what are you selling your fan base at that point? I think this is one of those things where if Taggart was recruiting at an elite level and having these seasons, I think they give him some more time. But because the recruiting's heading in the wrong direction, the record's heading in the wrong direction, and the attendance is heading in the wrong direction, it was clear a change was going to be made. But it's still a little bit surprising that they made it this quickly.
Yeah, I do agree there, but I guess they just couldn't wait. They got the money and time to move on. So. Well, there is a lot of Bob Stoops fire out there. I'm not sure I believe that one or not. That's usually if the first name that's hot is usually not the hire. We've went through a lot of coaching searches recently. We got a lot of experience in this. So usually the first big name that comes up, maybe it is Bob Stoops. I don't see it. It's just a prediction here. I don't know anything or anything. I just don't see him wanting to get back in. To that, but maybe having a big school in the state of Florida is enough to pull him in. I don't think Mark Scoops leaves Kentucky either. Like as you said, I think he's got a pretty easy setup there. Look, they've been loyal to him, so I think he could kind of see it that way as well and be loyal to Kentucky in the end. So I don't know if it's PJ Fleck or Matt Campbell or some assistant out there. But it will be interesting to see, as you said, Will, what the next coach is going to be asking for, and how much FSU is willing to shell out for their next guy.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're not just having to pay for Taggart; they're having to pay for all of his assistants too.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that Briles was not a cheap hire when they brought him in this past year, and then. So even a guy like Brady from LSU might be somebody that they might consider, just because they may need to go with an up and comer. They may not be able to go get an established guy. I just don't know whether that's enough to bring the excitement back that Florida State really wants for their program. So you almost feel like they have to make a name hire here, but a name hire is going to cost you an awful lot of money. And, I kind of enjoy seeing them go get the Mad Hatter. I kind of think that'd be fun, if nothing else, because we'd have some ridiculous fake punts and stuff going on, and fake field goals going on again in a Florida State rivalry. But
they need to get a guy who has recruited the state of Florida recently. One Jim McElwain.
Well, that's been a popular one. I will chip in for that if they're raising money, I will contribute.
Yeah, I mean, bring Greg Nord and Doug Nussmeier. I mean, bring the whole game back.
Oh man, well he's with the Cowboys right now, right? So
that's true. Yeah.
So I'm not sure that Nuss is available. So we'll know who to blame for the third and long play action.
Oh, all right. At least we can laugh a little bit.
It comes from a place of pain. We were in this exact same situation in Florida State like 3 years ago. So it does get better if you make the right hire. And I think Florida's proven that. And certainly, I mean, when you look at the guys who were brought in that year, Mullen has been the guy who's had the most success.
Yep. And it's not even close.
Yeah, well, and I mean, Taggart actually, I think, was like second on that list. So he wasn't great, but he was better than the other guys who, Scott Frost and Chip Kelly obviously have struggled quite a bit. But
was it probably Mullen and Jimbo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so those are the two guys who are ahead of him. But hey, we'll see. The thing is they ran Jimbo Fisher out of town for reasons that were always a little bit unclear to me. Like you said, it might have just been money. It might have been, and they just sort of with him being the heir apparent to Bobby Bowden and that sort of stuff, maybe he was just in sort of a weird situation. I know there's some personal stuff going on too, but at the end of the day, like, you took a guy who won a national championship and allowed him to leave, and then went and got somebody who had a losing record to start with, and a history of building programs, but not necessarily a history of sustaining them. And I think Oregon's happy with where they wound up. So
Yeah.
hey, they took a swing and missed, and we'll see who they swing at this time.
All right. We'll Vanderbilt coming up. What you got coming up on Read and Reaction?
Yeah, we'll have a preview. I think a little bit. We talked a little bit tonight about Emory Jones. Probably gonna be something up this week about how to use him in the offense, and where they can maybe get some benefit from bringing him in. Then there'll be a Vanderbilt preview, and that'll probably be it for this week.
All right. That's Will Miles. You can find him at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. I'm David Waters, host of Gators Breakdown. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.